Hello, I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. Welcome to First Five Now, a Freedom Forum conversation series exploring the complex questions our First Amendment freedoms face today and featuring newsmakers who put their freedoms into practice. Today, we explore how members of Generation Z, young people from their tweens to their mid-20s, are using their First Amendment rights to address some of the issues important to them. You'll hear from John Della Volpe, author of the new book, Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America, which illustrates how this new generation is organizing around their concerns and becoming politically engaged. Joining John is Zanagee Artis, who as a high school student co-founded Zero Hour, a youth-led movement addressing climate change. This program is brought to you by the Freedom Forum, which is continuing its year-long celebration of its 30th anniversary after its founding on July 4th, 1991, by my father, Al Newharth. Since then, the Freedom Forum has fostered First Amendment freedoms for all. Our vision is an America where everyone knows, understands, values, and defends the freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And now please welcome our moderator, John Maynard.
Thank you, Jan, and welcome to First Five Now. I'm John Maynard, Senior Director of Programs for the Freedom Forum. According to the Freedom Forum's recent survey, The First Amendment, Where America Stands, Generation Z, and those are people born from the late 1990s to the early 2000s, could name the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment better than every other generation. In addition, more than any other age group, this new generation doesn't think the First Amendment goes too far and the rights it guarantees. Well, today we'll explore how Gen Z, also known as Zoomers, are exercising those First Amendment rights and speaking out, assembling, and petitioning on issues important to them. We are joined today by John Della Volpe, who is the author of the new book, Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America, which draws on his vast experience to show the largest forces shaping Zoomers' lives, the issues they care most about, and how they are rising to the unique challenges of their time. John is the Director of Polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics, where he has led the Institute's polling initiatives on American youth since 2000. He appears regularly on MSNBC's Morning Joe, and his research and insights are often found in national media outlets. He is also founder and CEO of Social Sphere, a public opinion research firm. We are also joined by a member of Generation Z, Zanagee Artis, a climate justice activist who has been determined since high school, when he wasn't old enough to vote, to begin reshaping climate policy. Now a senior at Brown University, Zanagee co-founded Zero Hour, a youth-led climate movement that creates entry points, training, and resources for new young activists and organizers. John and Zanagee, welcome to First Five Now. John, the subtitle of your book is How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. So I'll start with a two-part question. What are those fears and passions that they're channeling?
Well, thanks for having me, John. There were several groups of fears, I think, and just to put this into perspective, the book is focusing on Gen Z, 70 million young Americans, roughly between the ages of 10 or 11 and folks in the mid-20s. And I kind of discovered these fears 4 or 5 years ago, and they fall into 2 different categories. One is like a sense of fear for being kind of unsafe and unsecure, and I think that cuts from, in physical spaces, in schools, related to school shootings and public spaces regarding kind of gun violence. I hear that a lot. And there's also this kind of fear for economic insecurity that I hear. So there's like a general sense of insecurity, I think, driven by a lot of the public events that this generation witnessed growing up, both the financial crisis and obviously the school shooter drills. There's another sense of fear for the future of our country. I think that's related to democracy, that's related to climate. And then there's a fear and a concern about justice or injustice, and that means everything from like concern and protection about individual rights, as well as a sense of justice related to race, religion, and other potentially systemic challenges that they see within the institutions of our country. So those are among the probably the three buckets of fears that I track when I engage with young Gen Zers.
Right. And when you say channeling their passions to make change, how are some of the ways they are doing that?
Well, these fears, along with the traditional challenges that young people have growing up as adolescents, around body issues and personal relationships and other kinds of stress, they've added up to a majority of 52%, according to our recent polling, of young people having like significant challenges around their mental health, depression, anxiety, sense of hopelessness, etc. But rather than withdrawing from these fears, they're as you said, I talk about channeling them, and that's channeling their voice to stand up for justice, channeling their kind of community to get out and protest. And what I'm most excited and optimistic about is channeling their votes. We've had two elections, 18 midterms, the 20 general election, where we saw record turnout among this demographic group. So that's how they're both channeling, among the ways they're channeling those passions.
Zanagee, as a member of Gen Z, a Zoomer, I guess you can call you, tell us what do you think some of the issues are out there that are motivating your generation?
Yeah, I would say I definitely agree with all of that. I think that safety and security and the idea of having a future is key to why young people are mobilizing the way that they are right now, why we decided to vote in record numbers here in 2020. And for me, as a climate activist, the future is always on my mind, and ensuring that we have a future that is livable, that limits warming from climate change, but that's also related to safety today. We know that wildfires are happening at alarming rates, flooding is increasing, climate disasters are on the rise here in the US and around the world. And so that's top of mind, and that's why people are mobilizing. But we also know that these issues are connected with other systems of repression related to racism, related to what we're seeing in police brutality, related to access to healthcare, access to education. And so all of these things are really coalescing in a way that is really exciting to see as a movement, that people are actually really bridging social movements together. And so climate justice movements are supporting movements to end police brutality, for education access, for healthcare access. And so that is exciting to see, but it's actually also because it's so necessary and so vital to young people that these things happen, that we have a future where those rights are enshrined.
Yeah. Zanagee, staying with you, when did you first get into the issue of climate change and the co-founding of your organization Zero Hour?
Yeah, so I co-founded Zero Hour in 2017, and I did that to get involved in the climate movement because there was not a space at that time where young people were really centered, where young people were leading a space of organizers. And so I did that with some friends in 2017, and I'm still doing that now. But I think that was far too late, and it's late for a lot of people. But the reason that I did that is because that's when I was really learning about climate change and what that system actually means, how it harms people. Because before that, I was thinking about sustainability, thinking about individual actions I could take at my school or at home to reduce waste. And then I learned about climate justice and how this whole system designed to oppress people and to extract from the environment and to continue polluting. And that's what really got me involved in the climate justice movement, more so than just working on sustainability. And so I think also it's just important to keep introducing these concepts and these ideas to younger generations of people, because kids deserve to know, and young people deserve to know about climate change and the world that they might inherit.
John, as I mentioned in the opening, Gen Z, more than any other generation, know and have a deep respect for the First Amendment. So, which freedoms in your findings of the First Amendment do you see them utilizing, in their social activism?
So John, again, we're about to release another survey where to give you some sense, among a dozen or so issues and values that we tested, protecting individual rights and freedoms literally was number one among all Gen Zers in our survey. It was near the top for Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. So as you say, protecting the First Amendment is essential to how this generation thinks about their values and their commitment to making the country kind of a better, stronger place. And I think they use each of these cornerstones throughout kind of throughout their lives. So obviously, kind of the sense of like freedom of speech, especially as it relates to, they would argue, kind of the most vulnerable among us and among them, and standing up for that, for those principles. Or sense of religion, it's clearly, when you pull it, something that younger conservatives, would rank higher. But of course, it's still important for everyone, regardless. But it's a particularly kind of resonant for younger Republicans and conservatives of this generation. Of course, freedom of assembly makes, with all of the work, from Parkland to the school strikes to the work around George Floyd protesting have just been kind of essential. And each of those elemental to this generation, and each of those movements, I think, really have been asking tough questions to governments. So I kind of see, this generation really kind of living, each of these elements of the First Amendment, in their kind of day-to-day lives. Of course, there's this battle, right, in terms of the definition of press, and one of the things I'm seeing, right, is this creeping in of misinformation and disinformation as younger people search for kind of independent media. But of course, that's nothing that's necessarily kind of different between this generation and others. There's always, I think, will be a growing concern about the press.
Zanagee, I'd like to get your thoughts on the First Amendment. Maybe a two-pronged question here. Do you think your generation does have a firm understanding of their rights, and how do the freedoms of the First Amendment impact your work?
Yeah. So to the first question, I think that young people do have a strong grasp of their rights. And I think it's also something that can be taken for granted as organizers here in the US. And we have organizers around the world in Zero Hour. We have allies in the environmental movement in other places. And thinking about our friends in the Philippines, in Brazil, and Ecuador, and all these other places around the world that don't have the First Amendment, it is so risky to be an organizer and be an activist and an environmentalist in these places. And we were supporting a campaign called Defend the Defenders, because we're calling on governments and people around the world to defend people who are defending the environment in places where their rights are not being protected, where people are being killed for being activists. And so that is so important to think about. And young people here in the US are thinking about that. And we also appreciate the First Amendment here for so much that it allows us to do for organizing. So freedom to assemble. We launched Zero Hour with the Youth Climate March in Washington, D.C. The ability to march in the streets to call on our government to make change is not something that everyone has a privilege to do around the world. Freedom to petition. We just joined over 1,000 organizations in a letter to President Biden to build back fossil-free and end our reliance on fossil fuels. We also led an action before the new year in Washington, D.C. at the White House. And people risked arrest, and they were able to, and they had that right to speak out, and they weren't, threatened with death. And it's a thing that people face in other countries around the world. So, the First Amendment is huge for us. And then I'll just also touch on the freedom of speech, the ability to share climate science and climate information to people who need to know about this, to be able to mobilize and act on this issue, is core to our ability to organize. And so those are some ways that it's huge for us as organizers.
Yeah. This is a question for both of you, but I'll start with you, John, because you mentioned the large turnout in 2018, 2020. In talking with Generation Z, what do they want to see in their political leaders?
Well, they don't ask for as much as some of our political leaders think they ask for. It doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for our elected leaders to recognize them, to listen to them, to begin to address the fears that we've both been discussing over the last several minutes. So it's a sense of justice and fairness overall. In particular, how can our government help pave the way to have access to what they consider to be other fundamental rights, access to healthcare, access to a quality education, regardless of what zip code you're in, right? Access to affordable housing if you work for those sorts of things. So they're not looking for so much, they're looking to obviously not be shot, concerned about school shootings, obviously, and the clean environment, and protecting the environment. So, but there is much more nuance within these issues than I think a lot of our elected officials realize. And again, younger people are asking for a seat at the table. And by the way, I think they deserve that, especially in the current Washington, D.C. There is no question in my mind that President Biden is not elected. We would have a second term President Trump, if not for younger people, specifically in those battleground states of Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Wisconsin, because of the young activism. This generation of Zoomers supported Biden by more than 20 points in each of those states. Whereas folks in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and older voted for Donald Trump. Same thing in the Georgia Senate races, same thing in the House previously. So they're not looking for much other than to be listened to and a seat at the table.
Zanagee, would you take that question also about what you and your generation is looking for in our leaders?
Yeah, definitely. I think that response was great, John. I think, yeah, we are looking to be listened to and to have a seat at the table. And we've seen progress on that with this White House, with the first ever White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and with Jerome Foster II being a young climate activist, formally organizing with Zero Hour as a part of that advisory council. But more needs to be done, and President Biden actually needs to take that advice and use what this advisory council that he set up is actually recommending for environmental justice. We still need to be listened to about shutting down pipelines, shutting down Line 3 in the Dakota Access Pipeline, and ending offshore fossil fuel leases. And there is so much more that can be done that young people are calling for related to defending our right to a livable planet and our ability to live on this planet in the future, related to climate change. And so we are still looking for more action, but we are getting strides toward having a seat at the table, and we are excited about that too.
Yeah. Zanagee, I'll stay with you, but I also want John to weigh in on this. And this is, your generation is arguably the first generation to have always had the internet, and social media in their lives. So, what impact has that had on this type of social activism you're engaged in?
Yeah, so the internet has been a huge asset for us as organizers. And when we were starting out and planning for the Youth Climate March, we learned about the first Earth Day and how it wasn't possible to promote on Instagram. There was no Twitter to reach thousands of people to get out our message for climate. And so for the first Earth Day, people were sending letters. They were getting in their local newspaper and all of that stuff to spread the word. But now, in the digital age, we have so much more access to information, ability to connect with people here in the US and around the world. And that's been a huge asset for us because that is how we built a global network of organizers, of young people that are leading movements for climate justice around the world. And it continues to be useful for reaching elected officials as well. We can tweet out elected officials, we can tag them, we can share petitions using social media. And so that is also a really important venue for sharing our voices and sharing our opinions.
John, would you like to weigh in on the social media question in terms of what you found while researching this book?
Well, yeah, I clearly think that's a very, very positive element of that. That's the very best of social media, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about, the other side of that coin, right? Which is driving a lot of the fears, both those personal fears around adolescence and young adulthood, but also fears in misinformation and disinformation that that unfortunately some actors use to actually disenfranchise younger voices and younger voters. So with so many things, it's a two-edged, two-sided coin. I'm hopeful that younger people led by Zoomers can continue to get the very best out of social media, but we clearly need to be concerned about how others are using misinformation, disinformation, and we should be holding our technology companies accountable for that.
John, you're a Gen Xer, as am I. I'm curious, when you were putting this book together, how that informed your interactions and your viewpoints of Gen Z.
I talk about John being kind of embedded with younger people. I work on a college campus. I study them for a living. I have three living in my home most of the time, right? And I'm always kind of listening for that. But as I've gotten older, it makes some of my interactions perhaps even easier, right? Because I can say, like, tell me what people like me need to understand, right? Help me help you. Tell me what I need to understand so I can help be your voice, in conversations like this around our campus, in government and business and politics, etc. And you'd be surprised at how quickly younger people kind of open up when you just kind of give them that cue. So that's been something. And I've also noticed, John, like the sense of agency and voice and passion that they have. I mean, those are qualities that I don't think I had when I was their age, back, a few decades ago. And so I also see that kind of perspective and context that perhaps they may not see themselves.
And Zanagee, what message would you give the generation that's following you, and I understand that's called Generation Alpha, about getting involved? Obviously, these are kids that are under 10 years old, but as they grow up and get into their teen lives and early 20s.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that there is a place to get involved wherever someone is interested in the climate movement or in other social spaces. And it's important to share information about that. Like I said earlier, I learned about climate change and climate science and what climate justice really means very late. But I think that if these concepts are introduced to kids at a younger age, they will start to become more active participants in our political system, in talking to local elected officials and also their state and federal officials. And that was actually one of the inspirations for writing my book, a kid's book about climate change, which is for kids aged 5 to 10, to really introduce the concept of climate change early on as something that is accessible, something that might be a bit scary to learn about as a kid, but also something to share that we have solutions and we know where to go from here, and that there are also people who are fighting with them and fighting for their futures. And so, yeah, I think it's really important for kids and young people to learn early on about all the assets they have available to them, all the people who are fighting with them, to get involved in a movement for change.
Great. John, I'll end with one question for you, and that is, how hopeful are you after all your research and talking with Generation Z as they enter, adulthood, the workforce, things like that?
Longer term, very, very hopeful. I kind of end the book with some projections, maybe not predictions, but some projections about the future, essentially kind of when they're our age, 20, 30 years from now. Listen, it's going to be a very, very difficult path, obviously, over the next years and perhaps the next decade or so. But I just see this generation as being kind of a values first generation. We heard during this conversation, like this concern they have, not just for themselves, but for others, not just their generation, but for future generations. So I think that translates me to be like good public policy. It translates to be kind of good business and kind of good community building. So I'm very optimistic that America's best days are ahead, and a lot of that is driven through the values and the hard work of Gen Z.
And Zanagee, you are a senior at Brown University. You've co-founded an organization. You've written a book. But what's next? What's next? What's next for you after Brown?
Yeah, so I actually really don't know what's after Brown quite yet, but I am excited to graduate. I'm excited to continue working on environmental justice issues. I'm actually going to be heading to Antarctica in March, so that's most immediately what's coming up. But yeah, excited to continue mobilizing to share our stories. And I would love to be doing something for the environment, and whether that's in my actual job or continuing as an activist. I think that it's really important for people who do have, careers to also think about how they can continue to be activists and mobilize for change, whether it's at their workplace or with a larger movement. While they're in their career. So I'm excited about that, and I'll be thinking about that as I get ready to graduate.
Well, we have run out of time. John and Zanagee, thank you for all your valuable insights and for joining us today on First Five Now. And to all our viewers, we hope you'll share your thoughts about today's program via social media at the addresses listed below. And the Freedom Forum will be posting a recording of this program on the Freedom Forum YouTube page, where you can post comments. And we hope you'll like this program and other programs, and subscribe to the Freedom Forum's YouTube channel for more programs and videos on issues related to the First Amendment. Thank you for joining us today.